Have you ever wondered if you've lived before or will live again? Are you curious about what happens to your soul after you die? Or maybe you've met someone you're sure you've known before. Or maybe you're just wondering if you have talents, skills, and experiences from a prior life that could help you now. Hi, I'm Brownell Landrum, author of the upcoming We Meet Again trilogy, and I'd like to welcome you to the Life is a Trip podcast. The following story by Father's Buddha was written and narrated by Gary Scarpa. Gary was inspired to write this true story as a tribute to his relationship with his father and also because of his deep Buddhist spirituality and belief in the workings of karma. We hope you enjoy it.
As I served myself a bowl of meatball and escarole soup, one of Dad's specialties, I called to my mother at the far end of the table over the various conversations. "Hey, Mom. Now that I'm retiring from the theater, I'm going to be hanging out at the Buddhist Center all the time." "Oh, are you?" she asked. "Oh, yeah, for sure," I continued, with just a modicum of histrionics for her entertainment. "I'll be wearing orange robes now, and they'll be giving me a new name, something like Yeshe Dharma." Despite my teasing, it was true. I had begun visiting the Center for Dzogchen Studies in Westville, a trendy New Haven neighborhood, more than a year ago with a colleague of mine from school. We wanted to learn how to properly meditate. Little did I know that Dzogchen referred to a genre of Buddhist texts and associated oral transmissions and meditation practices in Tibet's Buddhist tradition. Nor did I have the slightest idea that Buddhist philosophy would have a strong magnetic pull for me. "Who?" Mom asked, her eyes two glowing full moons. I winked. Yeshe Dharma, a name I pulled out of my limited knowledge of Buddhist terminology. "Yeshe Dharma, huh?" she said. With her jet black hair and red and gold caftan, Mom was still looking glamorous and exotic, an aging Cleopatra. "I don't know what kind of name that is, but I always said you were eccentric." Ever since I was a young guy, Mom had called me eccentric. I never quite understood why, but I was beginning to think she was right. Unexpectedly, Dad piped in. "If you do that," he mumbled, "I'll break the Buddha statue into 1,000 pieces and throw it out." He was talking about a Buddha statue he had arbitrarily purchased at a flea market decades ago when I was in college, something I teased him about since I had been making my weekly trips to Westville. "When you go, Dad, leave everything to my brother," I would say. "Just leave the Buddha statue to me." It was truly a beautiful statue, a meditating Buddha about 1.5 feet tall. It had been a mess when Dad bought it, soiled and worn, probably from being displayed outdoors or stored in a dusty old basement. But he had cleaned it up, spray-painted it a luminous gold, and made a shelf for it in the atrium. It sat in placid meditation, slightly camouflaged by the lush green leaves of African plants that Dad grew in white brick planters. There was no denying his green thumb or his penchant for taking something old and giving it a new luster. "I'm sorry," I said, "but what did you say?" I had heard him, but I needed to understand. "I said, if you do that, I'll break that goddamn Buddha statue into 1,000 pieces and throw it the hell in the garbage." "If I do what?" "If you wear robes and change your name." Incredulously, I just let it slide. I was learning that sometimes non-action is the best course of action. And I was well aware that sometimes Dad's logic was beyond comprehension. He was, after all, 81, and he was also often drunk, being a household drinker like his father before him. In fact, I realized I had been sitting next to him over the course of the last 30 years to run interference for the grandchildren, because Dad never met a thought he didn't feel compelled to express, especially after a couple of drinks. The grandchildren, the youngest of whom was my daughter Mia, a college sophomore, were all present, and their chatter made it so that I was the only one who heard Dad's remark about the Buddha statue. The next night, I had taken a nap after school, as was my practice, and I was boiling water for pasta when the kitchen phone rang. It was Dad. "What's up, Dad?" "Hey, you want that Buddha statue?" I could hear in his voice that he was completely sober. I could also hear that his words, while not slurred, were laced with agitation. Yes, I said, someday I'd love to have it, but well, come and get the goddamn thing right now, he said, with an urgency that made me uncomfortable. Dad, when I said I wanted it, I meant that when you and Mom are gone, I know exactly what you meant, he said, interrupting again, but I don't want to wait until then. I want to get rid of the thing now. The sooner the better. Come get it. I'm cooking right now, Dad. Then come get it after you eat. I decided to extricate myself from the situation as cleanly as possible. Listen, Dad, there's no need for me to come up there tonight. I see you every Sunday. I'll get it then. He reluctantly agreed to the Sunday plan, but by the time Sunday arrived, I had completely forgotten about the phone call. As my mother was greeting my family, my father beckoned me over to the double doors of the atrium. What's up? I asked. Without speaking, he pointed across the room. I was lost. What are you pointing at, Dad? He simply continued to point, staring me down in the process. I studied the direction he was indicating and realized that the shelf which formerly served as home to the Buddha now had a statue of Jesus, the infant of Prague, that my father had for years kept on his bureau. It had been his mother's. Oh, I said, you put Jesus where the Buddha used to be. That's right, he replied self-righteously. That's my God. You can have yours. I considered explaining to him that Buddha isn't God, but I thought better of it. As I exited his house a few hours later, he made sure I took the Buddha statue with me. He gave me an old Afghan to keep it safe for the short journey home. Even though I had joked with my mother on that Sunday, much of what I said came to pass. In the months to come, I visited the Center for Dzogchen Studies 2 and 3 times a week. I took refuge and bodhisattva vows, and to my surprise, I was given a Buddhist name, Kunzang Lundrub, a name drawn from Tibetan Buddhist lineage. Dad needn't have worried, though. No one ever addressed me by my Buddhist name, and I never wore orange robes. He probably wouldn't have approved of my taking a weekly class to learn the Tibetan language, which seemed to me an exercise in futility, but my teacher, Lama Tsundru, said, maybe not practical you speak fluent in this lifetime, but learning now, good karma for next lifetime. I didn't pretend to fully understand his thinking, but I had come to accept rebirth as just as plausible as any other explanation of the afterlife. Lama Tsundru, born in Tibet and made a refugee by the Chinese in the 1950s, was also a venerable Tanka artist. As a fundraiser for the Sangha, he had offered a number of his paintings to be sold at a gallery in the greater New Haven area. The other teacher at the center, Lama Padma, encouraged all of us to attend the art show opening, which turned out to be quite a chic affair. There were lots of well-dressed customers and a table set with complimentary wine and cheese. I was surprised to see both of my teachers in street clothes, sport jackets and trousers, instead of their colorful silken Buddhist garb. Partway through the evening, I found myself in conversation with Lama Padma. He was the first teacher I encountered at the center, and I had enjoyed many discussions led by Padma after meditation practice. He had helped us examine our everyday challenges through a Buddhist lens, which I personally had found quite useful. In the course of our conversation, as we each sipped white wine, I decided to relate the story of Dad's Buddha statue. I had observed from both lamas in my months at the center that we could all laugh and enjoy humor without any sarcasm being part of the conversation. When I got to the climax of the story, my recognizing that the Buddha had been displaced by Jesus, and my dad's passionate exclamation, "That's my God, you could have yours," Padma almost spilled his wine as he exploded into laughter. Then he did a kind of reversal that I had learned was one of his defining characteristics. Padma suddenly grew very serious. "You understand," he began, "that your dad having that Buddha statue was no accident, nor is it an accident that you now have it." "No," I said, not having the slightest idea where Padma was going with this. "I understand," he continued, "that back in the early 70s, your dad visited a flea market and thought he was buying a kitschy item as home decor. But images of the Buddha don't come into our lives by accident. The real truth of the matter is that your dad was karmically predisposed to have the Buddha come into his life and subsequently into yours. Karmically predisposed meaning, I asked, puzzled. Karmically predisposed from his past lives to have that Buddha statue come into his world in this life. Wow, I said, taking a sip of wine. In truth, at that point, I was ready to drink straight out of the bottle. I had never thought of Dad as having lived past lives. Another way to look at it, Padma continued, is that your father giving you that statue was his way of saying that he was okay with your interest in Buddhism. I was skeptical, to say the least. You probably wouldn't say that if you had listened in on our phone call or witnessed him pointing to the statue of Jesus. Maybe, he said, but it seems to me that it was a gesture of acceptance, albeit hidden under a veil of gruffness. Each person we meet on our path is there because we have unfinished business with him from past lives. This is not the first go-around between you and your dad, and I assure you of one thing. His gifting that statue to you was good karma for both of you. Padma could sure make a guy think. I could only infer from his remarks that Dad had lived past lives, that this wasn't the first life in which I had come in contact with Dad, and that somehow Dad had, in fact, a connection to the Buddha. He's sure hiding it well, I thought to myself, except I also thought of instances Padma had given to us from Buddhist lore where the least likely fellow, like a hog butcher, turned out to be a great bodhisattva. Just one example of how over and over again our discussions with Padma challenged my preconceived notions in the best sense of the phrase. I contemplated that conversation with Padma many times, but especially on the day that Dad died 3 years later. I recall, about a week before he passed, having to leave his hospital room to take a phone call, and when I returned to say goodbye, the entire family had already headed to the parking lot. Lying in his hospital bed like an Egyptian king on a golden palanquin, Dad said, "Hey, Gare, I don't think I'm going to go to that nursing home." "What are you talking about, Dad?" He just smiled sarcastically, very certain of himself. "Yeah, I'm not going." "Dad, listen. Dr. Rinaldi said you need rehab. Mom is incapable of taking care of you. You've got to go." Then Dad smirked again and said the last thing of consequence I remember him ever saying. "Gare, don't you know me yet? Don't you know me yet?" In my heart, I felt that I knew him better than anyone, that he and I were cut from the same cloth. I also couldn't help but remember Padma's words. This is not the first go-around between you and your dad. It was almost too much to process. As destiny would have it, the next morning an ambulance delivered Dad to the nursing home. It was out of his control. 2 days later, to our surprise and dismay, he couldn't speak at all. 5 days later, my brother and I got the calls at our respective schools. Dad was dead. I hadn't any idea, only a few days before, that death was waiting for him just around the corner. I left school disoriented and sped to the convalescent home. It was the first time I had been in the presence of death outside of a funeral home or church. This viewing of my father's lifeless body was unsettling. No embalming or pressed suit and tie to dress the pale corpse. Just the startling vision of my once vibrant father, his mouth splayed open, his lips dry and gray, and a thin white sheet covering his lifeless body. So this is what death looks like, I thought to myself. As the raging wind screamed and cried outside the window, I marveled at how appropriate it was that the universe had whipped up a storm to usher Dad into the next world. Placing my palm on his cold head, I wondered how the karma that Padma had spoken of would play out in Dad's next life. We gave Dad a Catholic burial. It was, after all, the religion of his birth, the one he clung to. For the little laminated prayer cards that the funeral home provides at a cost, we chose the Infant of Prague. Today, my father's gold Buddha statue sits in an esteemed place on my sun porch, which serves as my meditation space. Nestled in the folded hands of the meditating Buddha is the prayer card with the image of the Infant of Prague. Looking down from a bookcase above is Dad's actual statue of the Infant of Prague, which is in close proximity to a photo of my father, looking confident and strong when he was perhaps 60. Together, Dad and Jesus are keeping an eye on me as I meditate. And of course, so is the Buddha. I only hope that Dad knows that today, the Buddha and Jesus coexist quite peacefully together.
Gary and the Life is a Trip group, thank you for listening to My Father's Buddha by Gary Scarpa. A retired educator and theater founder, Gary will publish his third novel, entitled Still Life, in August 2024. To reach Gary, visit www.garyscarpa.com or email him at scarpaauthor@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Hi, this is Brownell. For more of these transcendental tales, please join the Life is a Trip group on Facebook and check out my amusing and enlightening story entitled The End, which you can find on my website, brownelllandrum.com. That's BROWNELLLANDRUM.com. And please look for my upcoming novel trilogy entitled We Meet Again. It's a story about a famous couple reincarnated today to help solve a centuries-old mystery that will change the world.